Okay, well, we finished very much in the middle of things last week. We'd done Exmoor and the north coast of Devon, and we just started to work our way westward from the Dorset border. As we're always keen to point out, this is not an exhaustive list. Let's flash up the Hillforts Atlas Classic View a sec. Yep, so this has been a massive resource for these episodes, but despite having already visited over 100 Hillforts this series and counting, there are, of course, others that we haven't got to. Where we pick things up, we are just a little way south and east of Exeter and covered by woodland. It's Woodbury Castle. We are on a low rise overlooking the estuary of the Exe. The Hillforts, still covered with trees, have been a lower priority in this series, mainly because a protracted game of hide and seek with the ramparts is not going to be very rewarding for our audience. I mean, here are the ramparts of Norton Fitzwarren from a couple ago. You see? Yeah, look, there they are. Or Castle Nirosh, or Dudsbury, or Castle Hill Burley, you take my point. It doesn't diminish their significance archaeologically, but visually, it just leaves little that we can meaningfully show you. But Woodbury, despite being suitably tree-covered that a view from above reveals little, has surprisingly prominent ditches and banks. You can see them here in the interior, and then when you walk to the outer perimeter, yeah, very clear. In fact, a great example of you can see the bank here and then down to the counterscarp there. See? In fact, they're so deep, I'm beginning to suspect these might have had slightly more recent help. Normans, come here. Did you do that? Normans, look at me. Did you enhance these defences? Well, for a change, it actually appears not. There are records that the road that seems to so carelessly barge through the western side in fact dates to the 1200s, as attested by a charter from Tor Abbey. So yeah, tree-covered though it may be, well worth a visit, and judging from the car park, it's pretty popular. The next one, this is actually going to need a little backstory. So at the time I'm writing this script, this was just a few days ago. You know, we started filming Hillforts something like 6 years ago now. And so mostly, with this series, the footage was already there, waiting to go. But it turned out we had a few gaps for this episode, and the clock was running down to get these in. So the one day I had the combination of a day off and usable weather, in, bear in mind, November, the slight snag was that Jen needed the car for work by 2 p.m. So the only option really was get up at 5 a.m, and because this is November, that means driving in the complete dark for almost 2 hours, and yet the route Dorset to Devon is not a route you can really relax into. So eventually the sun rose about the time I was navigating some of the most ludicrously remote Devon roads that I remain convinced were neither made by nor for humans. Occasionally going through some small villages, but finally, and you know, credit where it's due, I thought the Hillfort was going to have no access, but there's a signed footpath and even an obliging spot in which you can park. And up the hill, this is Cadbury Castle March. Just to add confusion to the two other Cadburys we'd already caught, the ramparts here are at an impressive height, and courtesy of the info boards, we have these rather nice artwork recreations of a hypothetical gateway. So yeah, there's clearly effort here to make this rather impressive site user-friendly. Ploughing in the interior has shaved down the earlier phase rampart, but it shows up more clearly on the LiDAR. In 1848, the landowner emptied out what may have been a ritual shaft from the 300s AD, which contained various types of jewellery, and also a coin hoard from the 200s. A survey by E.M. Wilkes from Bournemouth University revealed traces of possible roundhouses, as well as much later Civil War use of the site. The trees were actually casting rather unhelpful shadows. You know, that low sunlight that we like, because it kind of italicizes the feature of Hillforts, well, that becomes a bit of a problem with the presence of tall trees. But the Devon countryside, I mean, the contours of the hills. I'd forgotten how this looks, that in winter, when the ground has taken a good soaking, the bluey greens that you get on a clear day are just incredible. In fact, I took a full 360. I'm not going to play it back at its original speed, but just enjoy this. So while, yeah, it had been an incredibly long and dark drive to get there, it's a pretty incredible place. You know, while a lot of people have said very kind things in the comments of the various rude things that people say from time to time, this week was a first for us, with someone accusing us of not putting in enough effort. Yeah, if there's any doubt about this, I am getting up at 5 a.m. in the morning and undertaking nearly 8 hours of solid driving just so I can show you a handful more of these. And that's not even including the last 6 years of going to all these spots. So Look, if you could at the very least drop a like on this episode, and a subscribe obviously would help too. And before we get too far, title drop. Well, after Cadbury Castle March, we were heading south through the outskirts of Exeter, and I'm not going to do a big explainer on Exeter here, mostly because I need to film it some more, but also when we've passed a civitas on this series, we usually haven't taken too much time to remark on them. If you're not caught up, a civitas was a regional Roman capital, and in Britain, these were mainly made along existing tribal lines, though undoubtedly in a very generalised way. We've unpacked this in previous episodes, particularly numbers 3 and 4, where we looked at the geophysical in more depth, and we're also privileged to have a chat with Dr. Miles Russell about this, which helped clarify so many things. This is why we wanted to do this as a series. I'm sort of assuming people can broadly pick up most of these terms just from context anyway, but it means we don't have to explain every term every episode. But we are getting to the point. If there's another history channel that's putting up this many sites on screen, I am yet to come across it. Shout out to Depp, who's been a long-time supporter and is doing some superb aerial work across many UK sites. But our priority has always been, if we're going to talk about these places, we actually go and film them, not just lazily loop a handful of stock images, definitely not boil a few oceans to slop up some AI garbage. Actually go and film these places and show our working with the sources. And not only are we not even halfway through with all the Hillforts we've got to show you, this is just the start. We've not just been filming Hillforts around these last 6 years, we've been catching things like ruined monastic sites around the UK, which are these, are you kidding me, beautiful places that puzzlingly I never hear talked about with anywhere near the enthusiasm they deserve. Current count on those, it's about 90 across all parts of the UK, with some in the Republic of Ireland and more to catch yet. But not to be outdone, we've also been doing things like Norman castles, Saxon sites. A lot of what survived from then is church architecture. Roman sites, depending how you slice it, it's got about 120 of those and counting, but that's just in the UK, as we've also been filming Roman sites all across Europe and into Asia and beyond, which probably somewhere between doubles or triples that total. I don't even have all of that footage in one place right now. And I haven't mentioned Neolithic sites. I'm not just going to catalogue our entire filming library here, but with all the AI accounts treating you like a moron who doesn't know any better and just confidently lying to your face, if you were looking for an antidote, this is it. So please give us a hand. Subscribing and liking is obviously a big help, but to be honest, you'll probably need to hit the bell to actually have a chance of YouTube showing you our new episodes, as they usually only show it to a fraction of everyone who's subbed. You can also support us more tangibly at Bandcamp, but more on that later. Looping back to Exeter, and while the Roman civitas of Isca Dumnoniorum bears the name of the Dumnoni people, this provides us with a slight problem. So this schematic, courtesy the writings of Ptolemy, this is late Iron Age Britain on the eve of the Roman arrival, and you have the Durotriges in Dorset, and then beyond that, everything is just labelled Dumnoni. Now, with the sheer diversity of what is going on in the West Country, the idea that everyone from Lyme Regis to Land's End were all just part of one people called the Dumnoni, and that's actually how they saw themselves, it just seems wildly unlikely. We're somewhat looking into a near void of sources, and this will need more unpacking in the next couple when we get down to Cornwall. But yes, to cut the discussion short for now, there's not much I can show you out in the open from Roman Exeter, let alone anything pre-Roman there, so that'll doubtless be a job for another of those series I've mentioned. Which means we're now heading south and past the eastern edge of Dartmoor. Before we discuss Dartmoor itself, we encounter a group of around 3 sites within a short distance of each other. So we're cutting to an early morning in February, and this is Fursdon Castle. It's partially tree covered, but the winter really came through here. With fewer leaves, it's a little easier to make out the banks, which are pretty impressive in size. I think I'm going to need to flash up the LiDAR a second. You can see it's a bit of an anomaly. It appears that the slopes to the west, north and east were doing enough of a job such that you only really needed significant ramparts to the south, but it also appears to be multiple disconnected ramparts. We've also got a bit of an in-turned entrance here. I know none of this is particularly easy to pass just when you're looking in the landscape. Then only a couple of miles down the Tyne River, pardon us for a bit of a jump, It's now August, a few years back, and we were enjoying a bit of a walk in the valley by Fingal Bridge, and in particular looking to catch a glimpse of Prestonbury Castle. This is situated on a pretty impressive rise above the Tame Valley. There's a little more to this than just the most obvious banks you can see. There's other layers further down the slope. Wasn't sure that maybe these had subsequently collapsed, or as best I can tell, Hillfort Atlas seems to infer that ramparts just weren't needed above the ravine in the first place, which, yeah, would also make sense. Now, on this occasion, we did try to get a shot of the other hill fort, just on the opposing side of the valley, but we'd underestimated the height of the valley walls, and even after walking upwards for quite a while, we still didn't make it, and we were on our way somewhere, so we had to abandon it. Meaning the clock winds forward to that February morning, and it's an impressive one. This is Cranbrook Castle, and first of all, that is a nicely preserved gateway, and if you look closer, yeah, those are some stone ramparts. Okay, this is quite the sight. Hillfort Atlas notes this as probably the best stone-built hill fort in Devon. We've seen a few of these start to pop up in Somerset, but in Devon, they are rare. You'll notice a disparity on how well defended it is on this southern side versus the northern side. This doesn't appear to be the result of the plough to the north, and yeah, it's possible that the site is unfinished. There was a paper from 2011 that suggested it maybe just didn't need quite as conspicuous defences to the side facing both the valley and Prestonbury on the other side. There were some partial excavations in 1901 of 2 hut circles. You can't see them on the surface, but pottery and a quern were found. So it's a tight cluster of these sites here on the edges of the valley, and at this point we are right at the cusp of Dartmoor. And while we are going to talk about this, unless I've pivoted to a very different title and thumbnail than what I was planning while writing and recording this script, we have on our hands a bit of a puzzle. Dartmoor is incredibly special for many reasons. Amongst them, it has some of the country's most remarkable Neolithic sites, but not content with that, you also have some of the most significant Bronze Age sites in southern Britain. Between this and Bodmin Moor, the fact that you can just step into these settlements that are still visible on the surface, it doesn't take very long to get used to spotting the Bronze Age hut circles. And so far in the series, you are very lucky to catch a sight of a hut circle at a hill fort. You really need either frost or a drought, and even then, you're only really going to be seeing them from the air. Yet here on Dartmoor, you can step into the houses of its prehistoric settlements, just right through a partially surviving doorway. It's incredible. So what about the amazing hill forts that are here? Come on, I know Dartmoor's got hills, let's see them. Yeah, about that. What we see on Dartmoor is that the landscape is largely abandoned in the late Bronze Age. In fact, it's one of the reasons we have these phenomenal Neolithic and Bronze Age sites here, where everywhere else in Britain they were long replaced by, well, just everyone and everything. But why though? Well, if you've caught our series so far, you'll know that we do have these paradigm shifts in the use of the landscape. One that brings about the hill forts in the early Iron Age, and correspondingly one that, about 500 years later, leads to their near wholesale abandonment in the late Iron Age. Well, while we only have the faintest clues as to the motivations behind these changes, we actually have a pretty good notion of what was happening in the later stages of the Bronze Age in Britain. Just a quick reminder here, Dartmoor is high. It's a raised landscape of Carboniferous granite, which is what you see poking out so dramatically at the various tors. This is in stark contrast to the rest of the land around it in Devon. At its highest point, Dartmoor is 0.6 kilometres above sea level. What this means is it has a very different climate from the rest of the region. Thanks to the soil and the environment receiving quite a lot of study, we have a pretty good idea of the prehistoric makeup of the Dartmoor landscape. Barry Cunliffe elaborates on this, that by the late Bronze Age, the areas above 1400 feet had peat bog to about a depth of 2 feet. That's really the exact opposite of what you want for agriculture. There's been a trend so far of Iron Age people prizing, for example, chalk landscapes because they drain very nicely. And it appears that while at certain altitude there were still forests, any area of woodland that was felled would not then recover and regrow. Instead, it reverted to moorland, so the landscape was degrading with continued human use. Nowadays, the trees that aren't part of a modern plantation only cling on in a handful of small places, such as Wistman's Wood, very worth a visit. And then we have this rarest of things, a hard date for an event in prehistory. Based on tree rings, that's dendrochronology, if you want to be caught up on the proper terms, we have evidence of massive rainfall for a period around 1159 BC and for pretty much the next 18 years. Now, there's a good chance this corresponds with volcanic activity from Mount Hekla in Iceland, whose eruption may have ejected a large amount of particulate into the upper atmosphere. It's also possible that material from a passing comet might have been the cause of the planet-wide consequences we see everywhere from Dartmoor to Bronze Age Greece, even China. There's also suggestion of a wider trend of a prolonged wet phase on Dartmoor between around 1395 and 1150 BC as it is. And unsurprisingly, we don't believe this was just isolated to Dartmoor. This climate event may have been a major inciting incident that would culminate in the building of Hillforts. Toby Driver describes how upland areas of Wales became waterlogged, transformed into peat bog, and with agriculture near impossible, it may have predicated a major move of people, which then had a domino effect in the lowland areas where agriculture was still viable. And this created more competition for resources, meaning people had to defend territory in a far more aggressive fashion than previously seen. And this may have snowballed into the culture where hill forts are being significantly fortified. Now, granted, we are looking at this over a time span of centuries, so there are going to be other factors at play as well, but this might have been one of the first dominoes to fall. And it's why we only see Iron Age hill forts on the fringes of Dartmoor, where the landscape didn't suffer the same one-way transformation into peat. Now, sadly, a better exploration of exactly what's going on in Dartmoor in the Bronze Age is definitely on the cards, but I'm afraid it's outside the scope of this series. You've got enclosures like Grimspound. Just look at this beauty. And I'm not blind, I can see how hill-forty this settlement looked. It has had help. It appears there were some antiquarian restorations that may have been less than entirely evidence-based, but still, it'll have to wait. With the exception of just one site which Barry Cunliffe mentioned, on the eastern edge of Dartmoor, where you can still see a pretty stark before and after for what the soil type does to the landscape, there are the numerous hut circles we mentioned, which are a joy to explore, but in one site we do have some evidence of Iron Age occupation. The settlement at Kes Tor has several hut circles, but also this rather spectacular structure known as the Round Pound. Can't be the only one who thinks that sounds like some sort of wrestling format. There has been Iron Age material found in the archaeology here, tentatively dating the site to the 400s or 300s BC. It's believed that this huge structure here had a roof supported by posts and specifically needed airflow in and out because there was iron smelting taking place in this structure. But as well as being right on the edge of Dartmoor to the east, this is somewhat of an outlier. Cunliffe notes that it was an unusual ingress into the area which was probably already quite degraded, at least in the soil, probably by a people largely dependent on its flocks. Though, yeah, the soil here is also the worst possible type for animal bones to survive in the archaeology, thanks to acidity, so we can only infer. Yeah, so with regret, the huge topic that is Dartmoor is going to need to be a job for a series on the Bronze Age or the Neolithic, where we can take more time for those things. But staying on the fringe just for a moment longer, as already mentioned, we don't tend to prioritise hill forts with heavy tree cover, and there's a few of these on the fringe, but just above the town of Buckfast, famous for its abbey, one which is partially visible, Hembury Castle. Confusingly, we've already had a Hembury in Devon. Not only is this a univaliate hill fort, but, oh look, a Norman motte. Yeah, no surprise at this point, this just keeps happening. So, the site slopes off quite drastically to the east, down to the River Dart in the valley below. When you get the camera moving, the ditches and banks become a lot more clear, like, yeah, okay, I kind of see it now. You can see the sort of broad C shape of the settlement. Hillfort Atlas suggests surface traces of at least 4 roundhouses. And yeah, I mean, while it goes without saying, absolutely beautiful views across the Devon landscape. As you've been seeing, we've had to catch these at very different times and seasons, and so we're now cutting back to that very recent occasion, having driven since 5 a.m, and we're now just outside Newton Abbot, so we're between Dartmoor to the east and the coast. And following on from last episode, was quite excited to catch this one. This is Milber Down, and it's another multi-enclosure site. It's not quite as fortunate as Cloverley from last episode. It's got a road through the middle and a lot of tree cover on the eastern side. I said last time that I'd not been able to pull up more substantive information about multi-enclosure sites in the narrow time windows we have to get these scripts done. So I'm very pleased that not only has more work been done at Milber, and there's some good papers on it, but Barry Cunliffe also did really come through for this. Absolute original gangster that he is. I'm now rereading Iron Age Communities in Britain, a few key points he makes on multi-enclosure sites. After discussing the settlement morphology of various sites across Bodmin and Dartmoor, he conjectures that the multi-enclosure sites that are most numerous across Devon and Cornwall, as seen by this diagram, may be a later expression of the communities that had formerly lived in these, what are called nucleated settlements on the moors, though he is careful to point out he's not leaning too hard on this interpretation. He notes that multi-enclosure sites tend to be on hill slopes or places more sited for their agricultural benefit than defensive strength. As we noted with Clovelly last time, the inner enclosure tends to have deeper, more sturdy banks and ditches, and the various enclosures are interlinked by entrances, the outermost main entrance being particularly sited for convenient access to a spring or water source. He also mentions Blackberry, which we saw last week, as a third type of this multi-enclosure site, with the Barbican entrance being something a little different. Now, I haven't been to most of these, but you can see that Clovelly and Milber between them are among the most extensive. In summary, he interprets that based on other sites, the innermost and smallest enclosure is where owner and family would most likely have lived, with the outer enclosures as pasture. He also frequently cites Castle Door as a parallel, which we'll get to in our Cornwall episodes. Just briefly, for more detail on Milber in specific, you've seen it's somewhat better hidden than Clovelly. The bank of the enclosure should continue here, but it's been completely scraped flat by the plough. The trees are also making the site harder to make out, but you can just, as you look through there, you can see some of the ditches continuing. There was a dig here in 1937, which yielded some impressive finds, now in the Torquay Museum, which sadly I've not made it to. This rather great paper from Darren Baker details a recent survey he undertook, but it quickly became apparent from the gradiometer that extensive cultivation had made the central enclosure devoid of obvious features. And all sorts of activity at the site has muddled things. It was even a campsite at one point. This older sketch of the site shows a couple of additional features, a lot harder to spot in the landscape now. A wider bank enclosing a much larger area around the central system, and also this miniature enclosure that was excavated before modern buildings were built over it, and this brought up some material for mid-1st century AD, as well as some provincial Roman material. Anyway, as you might imagine, was very excited to be able to open up a bit more of what's going on with this type of site. Following on from there, we're around South Devon, and there's a couple of highlights. First of all, Blackdown Rings. So got this on a windy day in October, and good golly gosh, but does anything stand out here? I'll give you a sec. Yep, it's another motte. The Normans gonna Norman. But the Iron Age work here is still nice and prominent, with the banks surviving pretty high, and while you might not notice it when you first arrive, it's at quite the strategic high point, with excellent views in an arc to the south. It's actually one of the highest points south of Dartmoor. The gateways to both the east and the west are also believed to be original. A little way to the south, and I know that Devon residents will scoff at me for pointing this out, but the roads to this next one are absolute Satan. Narrower than a walk-in shower, and high banks walling you in. Turns out I'm pretty bad at reversing for long periods, which earned me not an inconsiderable amount of scorn from the locals. These are genuinely some of the worst, which contrasts rather sharply with the coastline at Hope Cove, which is absolutely irresistible and was looking particularly gorgeous with the tide partially out. Now, we're not just here for the beach, of course. If you take a short walk up from the village, you reach a large headland with very prominent banks. This is the promontory fort of Bolt Tail. We have referenced promontory forts a few times in this series, but now we're in Devon and heading for Cornwall, we're going to be seeing a lot more. Now, often you see at promontory forts that nature has already made a choke point, and just digging a single trench and bank is quite an effort saver. But in the case of Bolt Tail, there's not much evidence of effort being saved, with a massive rampart stretching around 270 metres, and it almost certainly would have originally stretched to the water had the terminals not now eroded away. The rampart is formed of earth and stones. It's actually not the easiest to see in these shots, but the line of the ramparts is not a clean, straight line. It actually curves around and over a natural rocky outcrop. And of course, the views are phenomenal, particularly all the way up the coast to what is now Plymouth. So if you can survive the drive getting there, this is a pretty special one. Kind of puts me in mind of Hillsborough around Ilfracombe from last episode, a promontory fort that has ramparts of unusually grand scale. I haven't quite got a handle on what, but I know Toby Driver is up to something with Bolttail and other sites like it. I'm impatient to find out what, but he is very much worth a follow on Blue Sky as well. While, as ever, there are hypothetically other sites we could have included in Devon with varying levels of visibility, we have just one more this time. And it's a great one to finish. We're back on the southern fringes of Dartmoor. This is just outside the town of Plympton, and if you head a short way through Canwoods, you find no access. Boo! Yeah, apparently this got too popular with dog walkers and was getting suitably eroded that it was closed off. Well, there we go. But this is Borringdon Camp, and it's very nice to look at. Apparently, for all the gaps you can make out in the ramparts, the one to the south is the only original entrance we can identify. I had some doubts I was actually interpreting this right, but it appears this feature is part of the gateway that's been somewhat mutilated and, yes, blocked. But while I can't show you this, even in the LiDAR it's pretty faint, but it may have originally had a barbican around its entrance, somewhat like Blackberry. Well, with that, we are just on the edge of Plymouth. Truthfully, I don't actually have great footage of this, but this puts us at the mouth of the Tamar, the river that delineates nearly the entirety of the Cornwall border. And this is exciting. There is a lot to catch in Cornwall, and some of it is considerably more intact than all the ditches and banks we've been showing you so far. So please hit the bell so you can catch those when they come out. And look, of all the things we've mentioned, whether it's episodes on the Bronze Age in Britain and the sites around Dartmoor, or Neolithic sites across the UK and beyond into Europe and the Levant, or later into the Roman conquest of Britain, I'm not going to just keep going with the list. It's a lot. And believe me, I'm impatient to get onto it. So for now, just to help us out, all the music you've been hearing in the background is ours, and you can find it on bandcamp.com. That's what we've got instead of a Patreon for now. And the most tangible way to support us, just flick us a couple of quid for the music there. Or you can also stream it for free, that's also cool. Otherwise, you can catch us on Blue Sky. That doesn't suffer from the same delay as the 20, 30 odd hours it takes us to make just one of these episodes. So you can see what we're up to on a more week-by-week basis. And otherwise, we'll catch you very soon.